Namaskar, everyone, and I am Abhinav Agarwal. Welcome to this new episode in our podcast series where we talk with authors, we discuss books, we discuss writing. Today, we have with us the author of Adideva, 25 Legends Behind His 25 Names, a Yatra Through Puranas, Sthala Puranas and Itihasas by Srimati Deepa Bhaskaran Salem. Now, this is if you can see this book. This is the cover of the book. Very, very evocative and very very simple in its beauty. And this has been published very recently. And I'll read out a little bit about the author. So, from the back of the cover of the book, Deepa Bhaskaran Salem is a student of Hindu Dharma and Advaita Vedanta. She speaks and writes on Hindu Dharma, Itihasas, Puranas, Bhagavad Gita, parenting, and mental health in popular platforms and her own blog. She conducts workshops for children and adults with insights drawn from Sanatan Dharma. She has been a management consultant and marketing leader. She currently runs a technology marketing consultancy in the United States. Guided by her gurus, she is on a journey to achieve the bliss of Shiva, Shivanand. Namaskar, Deepa ji. Welcome to this podcast.
Namaste. Thank you for having me, Abhinav. It's been a joy to be watching you many times, and I'm happy to be part of this podcast.
Thank you. So, there are a few things that struck me about this book. The first one is that, 25 stories is by itself not that, the stories about Lord Shiva have been told in many, many forms, in many other ways. But what I like were two things in particular. The first one is a very simple style of reading. So before you have finished one story, you feel the need to start the next one and the next one and the next one. So it has got a very nice, feel to it that pulls you and keeps you engaged. The second one was that you have not picked the stories from just one source. You call it out as much in your right at the very cover and in your title of the book that these stories are taken from the Sthala Puranas and the Itihasas, and the Itihasas obviously being the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And even when it comes to say the very first story on Tripurantaka, right? You say that this story is taken from the Shiv Puran, but this is retold with some embellishments in the Mahabharata itself. And I think this is which one? The Karna Parv. And this is, I think, perhaps the only Upakhyan that is recounted by none other than Duryodhan to convince Shalya to become Karna's charioteer. So that was a fascinating parallel that I thought. But be that as it may, I like the fact that you have drawn upon several sources. So let's start with the very first one. What were your sources that you went when collecting the stories for these books?
Sure, yeah. So as a Shiv Bhakt for a while, I've been very fascinated by many of these stories. I also felt, based on Adi Shankaracharya's guidance in the Shivananda Lahari, that these stories are meant for meditation. They are not just, kind of cool stories to know, which is, of course, they are full of drama and full of adventure and, all kinds of emotions. Yes, they are very fascinating. They're also a means of meditation. So I kind of started delving into what do they actually say, because all of us know these stories. We have heard them since childhood. But then, I've never taken the trouble of actually going and reading about like Tripurantaka, for example. But when I went and, dug into the stories, I just felt there's a lot of layers and layers of, information there. So primarily for these stories, and I started making a list of many stories that I wanted to kind of internalize. So the primary sources were really Shiv Puran. I mean, that's where you would start, and then for a Shiv Katha, of course. But then having read about, like you said, some of the stories in other sources, I also went and read, like, for example, Skanda Puran, where, for example, the story of Rameshwara is mentioned. And then obviously several stories are also mentioned in the Mahabharata. And I don't think that there was many mention of Ramayana in this particular book. But as I was doing that, I just felt okay, this is fantastic. We have the Itihasas and we have the Puranas, which are talking about a lot of the Shiv stories, but not all of those stories are there. For example, there's a story that from my hometown, Tiruchirappalli, with Trichy, where we have this story of Thiruvanekkaval, the story of the Lord there, but that's not mentioned in any Purana. That is only mentioned in the Sthala Purana. So I just feel there is a whole corpus of stories that were around that are part of the Sthala Puranas, but they have not made it into any of the Maha Puranas. So what do we do about them? Are we just going to ignore them because they didn't make it into the part of the Maha Puranas, right? Because they are a part of the worship tradition, they are part of the temple architecture. So I didn't want to ignore that. There may be countless reasons why they did not make into it, and in a couple of cases, the Mahapurana kind of mentions it, but there's no detail in it. The detail is filled in by the Sthala Purana. For example, the Mallikarjuna of Gokarna Kshetra. The Mahapurana, Shiva Purana mentions briefly that Ravanaya brought this linga from Kailasha, and due to Ganesha, this was installed in the Gokarna Kshetram. That is it. It doesn't say what happened and everything. Then you go into the Sthala Purana, that is where the entire detail is given. So I felt rather than looking at it from the focus of a book, I wanted to look at it as a focus of that name of the Lord, and look at where all this particular name is being addressed. It could be the Mahabharata, it could be definitely the Shiva Puran, and it could be any of the Sthala Puranas. So it's kind of, think of it as more of focusing, looking at it through the lens of the name of Bhagavan Shiva rather than one book, if that makes sense.
This is fascinating. Now, the very first story that you have here is Tripurantaka, right? And what, so what made you, there are obviously many more, stories behind just 25. In fact, the Mahabharata itself has the 1,000 names of Lord Shiva, right? Just as you have the Vishnu Sahasranam, you have the Shiv Sahasranam also. And one could potentially argue that there are, 1,000 stories behind those 1,000 names. How did you go about, see, some of the names, some of the stories are obvious, right? The Tripurantak has to be there. But how did you go about selecting the other ones?
Sure, yeah. So obviously, I was looking at many more names. There are probably like another 20 names that I have kind of, the stories for. But there are three types of names which I picked. Why would this came into this, right? One, because the stories are quite well known. The story, for example, of Shiva, the Parvati, Uma Maheshwara, right? Like that's when he
Right.
gets married to Parvati. That's well known. However, when I read through the actual Purana, I felt there are a whole lot of detail missing in the popular narrative. Unless somebody has actually gone and read the Purana, they would not know about it. So that is one category of stories where the stories are quite popular, but we are missing a lot of the discourses, the discussions that happen in the course of that story. The second category of stories are the names are kind of known, but the stories are not very well known. Like Gokarna Kshetra, for example, the stories are not very well known. And the third category is some of those names are very regional. In fact, unless you live in a particular state, you would not even know about those names. Grishneshwara, for example, I know it's in the list of Dwadasha Jyotirlinga, but I have never paid it until I started like more of a serious study about Shiva. I'd never bothered to know who's this Grishneshwara. People in Maharashtra probably know that very well. Similarly, like I said, in Tamil Nadu, for example, we have some stories that are quite popular locally, like Chidambaram, which is a very popular kshetra, but unless you live there, unless you have heard about it, people typically don't know about the Gokarna, the Chidambara story. So those were the three kind of categories I looked at: popular stories, but the lessons are missing. The second category is kind of the names are known, but stories are not known. And the third is you don't even know. Many people don't even know about those names. So that is where I started. But to collect those 25, I had about I would say 42 or something. But then I said, only like in terms of real storytelling, in terms of like the adventure and something it's fun to read, and there's also lessons from the Gita about it. That kind of were my criteria for picking these 25. The rest of everything is obviously, like I said, 1,000 names. Many of them are just gunas of Shiva. So there is not much to tell. There's more to meditate on, but there's not much to narrate about them. And some of the stories are really more about bhaktas and not about Bhagwan. So there are a lot of stories where it's about them, how the bhaktas felt, and that's probably another could be another work in the future. But I was really focused on what did Bhagwan do here? What was his role? And what did he do to show his majesty or his compassion or, even his Raudra Swabhava? So I think those were kind of some criteria for picking the 25. I had to kind of otherwise, this could go, how this goes, right? Like it would go on and on. You need some kind of a structure, like you did with the Upakyanas. You could go on and on, but you have to pick a number because otherwise we'll be doing this project for years with nothing to show. So that was primarily the reason.
I think the joy of reading the text and rereading them itself can become a very, very fulfilling exercise. But I can understand your point about the need to have a well-defined boundary that you want to pursue, this reading within, and hence the book. Now,
and sorry to say, actually that this idea came from Nilesh Okji. I need to credit him for it because he's the one who told me, hey, he kind of had a quick look at it and he said, you need to put a boundary on it. Otherwise, you'll be doing this for a long time with no end in sight. So I should thank him for that idea.
Wonderful. There was when you were talking, you made this very interesting point that some of the more popular stories, like Uma Maheshwara, right? The meeting, Uma and Shiva, then the parting of Uma, then the birth of Parvati, and then how Parvati goes and she prays and then she gets Shiva. So the broad contours of the story most people will know, but as you very rightly pointed out, if you read the Shiv Puran, you discover so many nuances and episodes to it. I, for example, didn't know that Rama, Lakshman, and Sita play a small but vital role in the parting of Uma and Shiva themselves. So can you give us a couple of more examples of how within these popular stories also there are some of these other nuggets of wisdom and anecdotes that are somewhat missing in popular accounts, which necessarily cannot talk about everything. They have to abridge, and when they abridge, you end up losing some things out.
Yeah, sure. Even in that story, the Uma Maheshwara story, right? Everybody knows about the story where, Parvati has decided to, okay, have Shiva as her husband, and she does, initially she goes to, Himavan takes her to Lord Shiva and says, she just wants to serve you, right? Like initially it is never proposed, never a marriage proposal, it's more of serving. Even that conversation is very fascinating because Shiva is meditating in Gangavatarana because it is part of Himavan's kingdom. So Shiva is settling down in meditation. And because Narada Maharshi has told Parvati that, that Shiva is your prophesied husband. So Himavan, the father, takes Parvati and a couple of her friends, I guess, to Shiva and says, she wants to serve you. My daughter wants to serve you. And Shiva is first, he is in this celibate, kind of state then, right? He's gone through the Sati, obviously. The Sati episode has already happened. So he is in an intense celibacy. He's, in fact, I would say avoiding women at that standpoint. And he says, women are of no use to me right now. And they actually interfere in Prakriti. So Prakriti, right? So you have the Purusha Prakriti concept. So Shiva uses that and say, Prakriti is actually always troubling. Prakriti always creates problems and they always distract us from meditation. So I don't want anything. What would I do with a maiden in this place? Himavan is not able to counter that kind of objection. But you see, Parvati speaks up. This little girl, obviously she's Jaganmata and all of that, but in that avatar, she's a young girl, and she speaks up, and not just like a casual pushback, but she actually uses Sankhya, the philosophy, to say. It's very profound for students of Advaita Vedanta, you will know, because they always, people who study Advaita Vedanta, they try to bring it into the world, right? They will say, whenever it's opportunistic, they'll say, oh, it's all Maya, it's all Maya. That's not what it's supposed to be, right? When you're functioning in the world, it is the world. Only internally, like Bhava Advaitam, you have to have the Bhava of Advaita, but externally you have to do what you have to do. So there is this confusion that all of us have. But Parvati points it out to Shiva, saying, the very fact that you're meditating, the very fact that you're sitting here and doing a meditation and even talking about this is all Prakriti only. You cannot avoid Prakriti. That's where you are, right? Only in your bhava you can be Advaita, bhava you can be the Purusha. The moment you're saying that I don't want Prakriti, that itself is Prakriti only. Even the way of speaking or thinking or meditating is Prakriti. There is a very intense conversation. And Shiva is kind of stunned and he's like, okay, I got to confess that she's right. So it's just beautiful when you read those conversations, which are missing in popular narratives, right? And later too, just in that story, that how the Saptamatra, the transition of Bhagwan from this really horrific rupa, right, like is full of scary, is like snakes and bhasma and jata and all of that, to how he allows the Saptamatrikas, which is very beautiful. Again, he allows Saptamatrikas to dress him up like all the mothers do, and then he transforms into Sundareshwara, the beautiful. So many nuggets of these things. And then anyway, just that story itself, there are so many new kind of insights that come out when you read it. And obviously many stories, like the Bhikshatana story, we all know, where that's also in the Mahabharata, but he kind of these rishis are in Naimisharanya, and they are not Naimisharanya, in the Nageshwar Kshetra, right? They're doing this puja. They are in this whole Purva Mimamsa, right? So they're all into yajnas and homas and all of that, and they are not really looking at jnana. So they are very focused on the karma kanda portion of the Vedas. And Bhagwan comes as Bhikshatana, like a naked youth, very handsome, very attractive, and he entices the rishi patnis to follow him. And then simultaneously, Vishnu appears as Mohini and attracts the rishis. And finally, one of the rishis are like, "Oh my God, what are we doing?" And then they realize that they've been tricked, and there is this battle. That is where Bhagwan, like the tiger skin and the elephant skin and the deer and all of this, and this Apasmara Purusha, who's the Asura, and Bhagwan dances on him. And then it transitions. So all this is fantastic adventure. But then it transitions to the teaching, which is beautiful again, where Bhagwan advises them that Karmakanda is fantastic. It helps you purify your mind and all of that, but it's not the end. You'll still be chasing heavens or wealth or whatever, and you need to understand your true self. So it's a beautiful way to teach the Vedanta or the concepts of the philosophy, but through these very, very avocative stories. So I think there's a lot that goes on behind the scene, behind that, like the high level story that we all know. There's a lot of layers that go on behind it.
Now, in all these stories, so obviously, you have picked a few from the Mahabharata itself, but the Shiv Puran is, I think, a major source of the stories, given that, it is one of the. So, but you also have the Sthala Puranas, right? And when we started out, you talked about how one of the stories is not really found out. There's a very brief passing mention in about Gokarna, right, in the Purana, but you have to go to the Sthala Purana. So tell us a little bit about the Sthala Puranas, right? For many of us who may not know that there are these things as Sthala Puranas also, or at least when we read the Maha Puranas, we read about. So there is a subtle distinction between Mahatmya and a Sthal Purana. So there are Puranas that have these, Mahatmyas which talk about the glory of a particular Tirtha Kshetra, but then there are also these Sthal Puranas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, as you said, there are many of them, certainly more than 18 of them, but there is no agreed upon number as to what the definitive count is. But yet they contain a lot of information, especially about the local traditions. Tell us a little bit about, during the course of your research in the book, about these Sthal Puranas.
Yeah, absolutely. Growing up, I grew up in Tamil Nadu, which is obviously, like it's packed with temples of, very ancient temples. And many of these temples, even some small ones, will have some kind of a story associated with it, right? Which we call the Sthala Puranas. And these would usually say something about, there was some asura here and Bhagwan came and killed, or, or some rishi was there. And a lot of times Parvati herself comes and meditates. There's all kinds of things were there. I used to wonder where did they come from, because they don't have many mention in the Purana themselves. I think we can go into a lot of speculation around what happened. Maybe they were, whenever this Puranas were compiled, right, when the Maha Puranas were compiled, uh, some kind of a sutta at that point, I'm guessing, they, or Vyasa Maharshi, they collected all of this and they compiled it in some form, and some got in and some didn't for whatever reason. Is not, I mean, that's a speculation, obviously. But for that particular temple, that Sthala Purana is very, very important because it defines everything about it, right? It defines the Murti, it defines all the Parivara Devatas of that particular temple, it defines the particular stories that happen, the festivals that happen that are tied to that particular stories, the worship tradition, Ashtotras, the pujas, everything is tied to that. Not only that, when you look at many of the compositions, stotras, right, the Adi Shankaracharya, or many of the saints, poet saints, they all refer to that particular story. So there has been a reality given to that, whether they appeared in the Mahapurana or not. There has been a significant reality given to those Sthala Purana stories. They become part of the local, kind of milieu. People, associated with this, they know this. So there are, like I mentioned, in that one Gokarna Kshetra, there is a slight mention in the Mahapurana, if I'm not mistaken, in Shiva Purana, in the Koti Rudra Samhita, it actually says that in this particular Kshetra, Ravana did a very, Ravana got a linga from Kailasha after doing great tapas, and he brought us, and it was installed here due to the grace of Ganesha. I don't remember the exact words there, but that's what the Shiva Purana says. So, okay, it doesn't tell all the story, but then you go to the Gokarna Kshetra Mahatmya. There, it actually gives that whole story. It's a very cute story where
So is this a Sthal Puran in its own right?
it is a
The one
sthala.
on Gokarna?
Yeah, I think it's every temple has that. I don't know if it is where is it compiled? I don't know. It's just the temple's kind of a lineage, right? Like it's that's where it's mentioned. We have that, like
Right.
in growing up in Trichy, like I said, the Gajaranya Kshetra Mahatmya, the Chidambara Kshetra Mahatmya, or the Sthala Purana. Both words are used alternatively, but that is only case where I know that it's mentioned in the Shiva Purana and it's elaborated in the Sthala Purana. There are other cases where it's not even mentioned in any of the Mahapuranas, as far as I could tell, right? Like I did a search in like
Right.
Linga Purana and Skanda Purana, and it's not mentioned. So you have both situations. Of course, Nataraja, for example, Nataraja is a very popular form, and it is mentioned in the Shiva Purana. But this whole story about this, Chidambara Kshetra, what happened with this rishis, Patanjali and Vyagrapada, who came there, and then who they invoked the Lord, who danced for them. That is not mentioned in the Mahapuranas. It's only mentioned in the Chidambara Kshetra Mahatmya. So there are, I think you have to put things together and kind of make sense of it. I'm not a scholar. I hope somebody does it in some form in the future. But I think it's fascinating, nevertheless.
Definitely, this is desperately needed because we have, at least we are thankful that that when it comes to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, we have these critical editions that have become the source of many scholars, and we even say, for example, when it comes to the Mahabharata, right, we have not only the critical edition but the critical apparatus. So the scholars did the work of putting together not only this critical edition, but they have put in one place all the source material that they collected, and they decided for whatever reasons to leave out so scholars can go and study it. We don't have any such material for the Mahapuranas, for example. I mean, there are a few translations, and Shri Vivek Debroy is single-handedly
Yeah,
translating them,
yeah,
which is doing, I think, one of the greatest services I can
yeah.
think to the cause of Sanatan Dharma. But the Sthal Purans are quite another story. I think we need some research, some scholarship, some initiative there, and I hope that happens. Uh, In your let's The other question that I wanted to ask was that when it comes to the the styles of the Mahapuranas are also somewhat different. If you look at the Markandeya Puran, and if you look at the Shiv Puran, the style is very, very different in terms of how it talks about. Yet one gets a sense that the underlying message is still the same. Did you feel the same thing when you were doing your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, some of so Shiv Puran, right? Like there are learnings, like there are discussions around philosophy, but a lot is on stuti, right? Like so much stuti. Every time people stop and start praising Shiva, praising Shiva. There's just like whole lot of thing, which I found. There are narratives, and then suddenly there are stutis, which is true in the Bhagavad Purana also, for that matter. But you would see in, like, for example, Skanda Purana and all is much more descriptive. It's more, there are definitely differences. See, again, I mean, I just used to contemplate on it, like what could have happened. I'm just visualizing, again, by no means a scholarship or any kind of research here, but I'm just thinking these stories were all spread across India at some point, right? Before Vyasa Maharshi, probably. I don't know. Many of these stories were spread across different parts of Akhanda Bharat and probably even beyond, who knows. And then I'm just imagining that, hey, there must have been, like, Vyasa Maharshi himself could not have gone everywhere, but I am guessing he probably had an army of sutas, not just the Ugrashravas and Romaharshana, but probably an army of sutas who were probably today's, travelogues, right? Today travel writers kind of thing. They go everywhere. They would probably go everywhere. They would collect all of these stories. They would hear the stories. They'd go to a temple or a sacred space, and people would tell them, hey, this is what we do in our culture or in our subculture, and they would bring all of this back. And then there was some kind of an exercise to put them all together, right? So there are definitely regional stories that came together, and maybe different people who compiled it, all of them Vyasas in a way, things. So we can only speculate on it. I think there have been the Bhagavan's manifestation or Devi's manifestation across the land has been trying, form, tried to be captured and collated in the Mahapuranas, but obviously it's so vast that it's probably some of them have been left out. And thankfully, because of the temple culture, they've survived in the form of Sthala Puranas, right? And to be honest, I used to feel not by the destruction of temples that happened in, significantly North India, Northwest India, we not only lost the temples, I think we have probably lost a whole lot of the temple lore or the Sthala Puranas. So also my theory. There's no way to prove it, but because even now, like even like we went to Himachal last year, like each of those stories, like we went to Jwalamukhi. There's a Jwalamukhi story. There's a Chamunda. There's a Chamunda story, right? Bejna. There's a Bejnath story. Wherever the temples have survived, the temple lore or the Sthala Puranas have also survived. Wherever the temples have been destructed, we don't know, right? We don't know. There could have been countless more stories that also got destroyed when the temples were destroyed. That is just, again, my speculation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the case of Afghanistan, for example, that was a thriving center of Buddhist learning. When the invasions happened, within the course of less than 50 years or so, Buddhism was pretty much completely removed, eliminated from Afghanistan. And along with it, because all of the Buddhist monks were concentrated in the viharas, because when the viharas were destroyed, not only were the temples or the places of learning destroyed, but also the knowledge that
Yes.
existed along with it was also destroyed. Now, Hinduism, Sanatan Dharma, happened to be a lot more diffused that way. That the knowledge was present in not only these major centers of pilgrimage and learning, but also basically down to the villages, which is why it allowed us to survive. This diversity has unfortunately become a source of weakness also in modern times. But be that as it may, any particular stories that were your favorites? I'm not going to mention Uma Maheshwara, because that is obviously, I think, everyone's favorite. But
Hmm.
leaving that one aside, any other favorites of yours?
The story of Grishneshwara, which is one of the Dwadasha Jyotirlinga, I think the two words there are, the earlier name was Bhushmeshwara, but somehow it has been changed. I won't say corrupted. It's been changed to Grishneshwara. That's the current name, I believe, and it's Jyotirlinga in Maharashtra. This story I was completely, I had no clue about. The reason I love the story is it's not so much about Bhagwan there, it's about the two contrast of bhaktas. In the Gita, just in the second chapter, we have this notion of Sthita Prajna, who is, person who is of complete knowledge, who is, come wisest. But it also mentions this fall of man, which is like, how, like, when desires start, you kind of go down that ladder. People know this, dhyayate vishayan pumsaha sangasteshu upajayate sangat sanjayate kamaha kama krodho bijayate krodhat bhavati sammohaha sammohat smriti vibramaha smriti bramshat buddhinashaha buddhinashat pranashyati. So this Bhagavan Krishna lays out the fall of man. How does it start? Starts with the desire and that attachment, and attachment is not, you lose something, then it's anger, and then it's some moha, like your delusion, and you lose the smriti, but you forget what is right and wrong, and then you go into a vicious cycle of destruction. So you see those two things, concepts in the Bhagavad Gita, the Sthita Prajna, the wise man, and then somebody who falls down this ladder. And this, interestingly, this Grishneshwara story has both those characters in the form of two sisters. The first sister, who wants a child, is unfortunately unable to bear a child. Both of them are from a Shiva Bhakta family, but the older sister is unable to bear a child, and she's that's taken over her. That the inability to have a child has become an obsession, and in that obsession, she insists that her husband, and they do all kinds of pujas, everything, nothing works out. And the husband is, he says, hey, this is our prarabdha in this janma, and we have to accept it, and this is what Bhagavan wants for us. Let's redirect our attention to puja and all of that, but she doesn't listen. She insists that her own sister should be, the second wife. Like, her husband should marry her sister so that they have a child in the family. Her husband tells her, her husband warns her that, no, you're actually making, this is the delusion, right? Like, you for achieving something, you're going down the route of more trouble. And he warns her, you're going to be jealous. And she says, no, my own sister, I won't be jealous. And they come and they have a child, and her jealousy is just skyrockets. I mean, it just takes her down a path of so much evil. Even though the child is very, affectionate to her, she does. Anyway, the point is, she ends up. Long story short, she ends up killing that child. But the other, the mother of the child, the second wife, is actually a great Shiva Bhakta. Very, the Sthita Prajna of the highest order. Even when the child is born, she says it's Bhagwan's wish. Okay, great child, thank you very much. But when the child dies also, she says, Bhagwan is the one who plants these, the exact words, the metaphor she uses is that Bhagwan plants the trees, puts the seed when he wants to, and he makes them die when they want to, and I'll accept whatever is, his choices. Extreme Sthita Prajna. She doesn't even stop her Shiva puja. She continues to do the puja when she hears that her son is dead. But then the story is how, this lady buries that body in that lake where Shivalingas are being immersed every day, the Parthiva Shivalingas. And then he comes back again, and then Bhushma, who's the younger sister, says, Bhagwan just manifest here as a linga. So this story is, I think, as a Gita student, I felt, oh my God, this is just so perfect to understand how this whole ladder of fall can happen. At the same time, how is Sthita Prajna? So it's a form of meditation for me, like the two things, like how you not to be and how to be, right? So it's not so much about Bhagavan. That lesson, the end, towards the end, Bhagavan talks about this whole thing, like how she was a Sthita Prajna. He doesn't use the exact words. But that's probably my favorite story in terms of meditation. Sorry. I can't hear you. Sorry.
I had put my mic on mute. Okay. So I was saying this is such a fascinating story, and you have brought the some of these elements out so beautifully. I also like that you have put some photographs in here. For example, on page 115, when you're talking about the Somnath story, you You have a photograph from 1895 where the destroyed or the ruins of the Somnath temple are there, and then you have the one after it was reconstructed in 1950, and by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Shri K.N. Munshi, who was incidentally also the founder of Bharati Vidya Bhavan and who was also a great benefactor of Shri R.C. Majumdar's history project, The History and Culture of the Indian People. Uh, so truly we owe a lot to these great people who made possible the survival and the continuity of some of our pieces or elements of our
Yeah.
heritage and history.
And this one, right, the Somnath, I mean, just think of the antiquity, right? I mean, it's fascinating. Krishna worshipped there. It was, so ancient. It was called the Prabhasa Patan, right?
Prabhat
It was,
Kshetra.
it's Krishna did his tapas there to get, child from Jambavati with his Samba. So it's so ancient. And even prior to that, right? Even long before that, Chandra worshipped there when he was cursed. So it's such an, I mean, I don't even know how you can put a date on something like that, right? It's so such antiquity, and to see that got destroyed, and not once, it was destroyed multiple
Several times.
several times. But the one thing is, which is also the narratives of, and I'm sure you know this. It was apparently a very popular port, so it brought people from several, like Africa and the Middle East, and it was a thriving port and this massive temple. And I'm guessing sun worship was very common across the lands those days. So it was not just Hindu, like Indian Hindus who went there. It was a whole lot of people who came there. So that's just fascinating, and I'm glad that the temple is back. When
Absolutely. And we hope that many such more temples are revived and restored. One, in as we come to the end, there's one question that I wanted to ask you, and you have put this in your a note to the readers where you write that, like most things in Hindu Dharma, the same legends appear in multiple texts with minor and occasionally significant differences. In fact, the same story can occur with variations even within the same Purana. And then you write, scholars have attributed these differences to Kalpa Bheda, or the belief that these incidents play out in every Kalpa or cosmic cycle with nominal variations. Now, this was something fascinating. Do you want to talk a little bit about, Kalpa Bheda? And because there is this sometimes unhealthy obsession among many to put a definitive date to events that have taken place in our Itihasas and Puranas. I mean, the pursuit of a chronological how to put it, the pursuit to define and identify dates to some of these events that are described is one thing, but then I think it kind of crosses over into the boundary of an unhealthy obsession. But the Kalpa Bheda, I think, is a wonderful way of reconciling some of these differences. Tell us a little bit about it.
So there are, like I said, and all of us know this also, right? Like in many Puranas, we have different versions of this. And I was actually surprised to find those variations within the same Purana. I think this was the, where Brahmaji, that Vishnu Brahma competition happens, and, they
Yes.
want to find the linga of the fire. So this gets narrated in two different places. One time, Brahmaji himself is narrating it. Another time, if I'm not mistaken, it's Narada Maharshi. Interestingly, there's a slight variation there. And Brahmaji, when he's narrating, he kind of plays down his faults there. It's kind of cute to see that. So how can we explain that? I mean, there are some differences. I think the simpler way to, if you want to use Occam's razor, the simpler way to say it is eyewitness account, right? Even today, we have these versions, right? We talk about like the right-wing news and left-wing news. They see the same incident and they see it differently. That's an easy way to explain that, two people saw it and they noted it down differently, or it got transmitted down in different ways. That's a simpler way to say it. But I also think there is this Kalpa Bheda. We have this historicity, like the circular time for us. We have had this, and things are Bhagwan's manifest. The same incidents are supposed to happen in every kalpa in some manner. So there is a certain belief that we have, And I think it's also profound in that sense, because we are also acknowledging that we are a circular time, right? Like, to your point, if we are saying it's historic and that we kind of box ourselves into this Abrahamic way of thinking in a way. So I think I'm also a little conflicted about it, because there is a, especially when outsiders are trying to date us, I don't know what we can do, right? Like, you have outsiders who are trying to put a date for, they've already done it and caused immense damage for us in a way, right? Indus Valley or Saraswati Sindhu, whatever, they've caused damage. So there, do we not counter it? So there's a argument to be made there. But from a bhakta standpoint, from a Hindu practitioner standpoint, I think this Kalpa Veda is very important, because now you recognize that Bhagavan is not bound by this so much, like 3,000 years or whatever. This has been happening endless cycles of time. We are part of an infinite, and that I think I feel as a Hindu, the biggest thing is that you're not bound by 6,000 years of creation or whatever dates they say, or this manifestation of devata, that is it, or this devata. So I think we have to break out of that chronology box, or the space box, as a Hindu, because our devatas, our concept of devata is infinite, our concept of time is infinite, and the kalpas and kalpas, the mahakalpas have gone through, and we can't ignore that. If we say that we are only boxing ourselves to the last whatever few millennia, then I think it's doing a disservice to our tradition, or our belief in the endless time. So I don't have it, but I think Kalpa Veda is a good way to address some of these difference in narratives. And even, for example, even the Sthala Puranas, right? They're not mentioned in, for example, the Ramayana, or they are not mentioned in the Mahabharata, but still we have these Sthala Puranas. Are we going to say no to them? Because the local tradition says they happened. When they happen, we don't know, right? So we do have to acknowledge that there are things that have happened that are so ancient in time, but they have survived in some kind of a memory. You can call it like the drishti of the rishis. And I do believe that, as I'm not a very sophisticated meditator or anything, but meditation, it really brings out insights that a common man cannot relate to. So I do believe there is some authenticity to many of these stories.
No, very true. It is also when you talk about people writing about the chronology. I think it is an outside in point of view, which is necessarily not. It is also one that is laden with an agenda.
Yeah.
Many of them begin with an ulterior motive. They begin essentially with the end in mind, and the end is essentially to find some aspect of Sanatan Dharma to discredit or to bring into disrepute. So the very origins of their scholarship, I believe, are tainted. So, and this is something that many people have written about, including Sri Rajiv Malhotra. So,
Yes.
I think that is a whole debate all in itself. But I wanted to thank you, Deepa ji, for coming on to this podcast, Indica Books and Abhinav Narratives. And folks, we have been discussing this book, Adideva. It's written by Srimati Deepa Bhaskaran Salem, 25 legends behind his 25 names. Fascinating book. I think it's a short enough book that you can finish it off in a couple of days. But I think the lessons, or the what you get from it, what you enjoy from it, I think will continue for a long past. So thank you again for coming to this podcast, and we wish you all success in this book.
Thank you very much, Abhinav. It's been a joy talking about this work with you. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Namaskar, everyone.